Hello. That's better. Hi. How many people here have heard of Tailwind CSS before we? Good. How many like it? 2 people. How many have actually deployed something using Tailwind? Yeah. Multiple things. Brilliant. So, basically, I first heard about Tailwind. I don't know how long ago actually, come to think of it, but the point I'm making is when I first heard of Tailwind, I was like, what is Tailwind? Why is there another CSS framework? What's the point? We've got Bootstrap, Foundation, Bulmer. You can reel them off. But then I thought the guy who made Tailwind, the guy called Adam Wathan, and he is a guy who I actually respect quite a lot. And I thought he would not make a CSS framework if there wasn't an actual point to it. So we're going to say, what is Tailwind CSS? It's a post CSS plugin. So you need to use post CSS to actually compile it. It's a utility first CSS framework. So it's basically built using utility classes. And taken from the website, it provides the building blocks to create custom designs. It's customizable and unopinionated. So the question I have to ask is, who do we create classes for when we're creating classes to utilize our CSS? Because in my opinion, we're creating classes for us to read so that we know what the actual CSS is doing, so we know what that element is going to look like on the page. And if you have a class that just says button, what's that describing to you? It's just saying this is a button. But how do you know what the button looks like? How do you know what the button does when it's on a different size screen? Or how do you know what it does when you hover over the button? And the fact is you don't, unless you go into the CSS and look at it. And then doing that over and over again, it kind of it creates a cognitive kind of dissonance where you don't really, I think of the word I look for here. It's a thing where you're constantly going back and forth to try and find out what you're doing with something. So obviously Tailwind provides a multitude of utility classes, which means that your classes in HTML, I don't know, can people see that properly? Yeah. So obviously here you can tell that this section is on a medium screen displayed with flex. Its background's white. It's got a large radius on the corners. It's got a pattern of 6. You can just read what it's doing. On a large screen, it's got a bigger shadow than on a medium screen. So you can tell what it's like. You can tell what the component's going to look like in your HTML, which is, in my opinion, it's good. You can see what you're doing, and you can tell that by removing something from it, that's no longer going to apply. And that's obviously because of its utility-based framework. So we have the problem there, though, where we've got all of those classes, and every time you create something, every time you create a new element, you need to have those classes per element, which can get really tedious, and you just forget to put one on the next one, and it's, you don't know what's going wrong. However, if you use a component-based templating system such as Vue.js or React, Angular, backend frameworks have template engines, usually have some sort of component system in them. And Laravel Blade has its component directive now with slots, so you can utilize that. So if your CSS is in a component HTML system, do we need to worry about writing the classes out multiple times? And I would argue that we don't. Because with the CSS is in a component, you just reuse that component and the CSS is applied. And then when you want to change the styling on that component, you can go into the actual, into the component and then change the classes on it, and it's fine. And so basically, the last thing I've got there is what styles get applied when you add your card class to an element. You don't know unless you've written it. And then if you give that to somebody else, they're going to have to look at the CSS to see what the card actually is, to see what styles have applied, so that when they've got to change it, they've got to go and change CSS when really they just want to add a rounded corner on it. So the argument can be made there is to why not just use inline styles on everything? Because if you're putting them in as classes, why not just inline style everything? But if you're using inline styles, you can't utilize media queries, whereas with utility classes, you can. And you can't use pseudo classes, so your components won't be reactive. So basically, we use utility classes to make our styles responsive and reactive. So let's say you have a button. So I've just talked about using a component. But if you have something like a button, you don't want to be creating a component and then reusing that button like 20 times. You can just extract a component class with Tailwind using the apply directive. So basically here I've got the button, created a button class, applied some default styling to it, and then obviously added a hover state to it as well. But if you do this, obviously that top button's going to be the blue button. But then when you add on extra extra classes, like they will be added to the component. So it's like it's a utility class. So you're creating a utility that is a button to prevent having to add all of those classes in the top section over and over again per button, which I think is pretty cool. So Tailwind is like completely customizable. It comes with a default theme by Steve. I can't pronounce his surname now. It's typical, isn't it? But like it comes with a default theme, and you can customize it in any way. Like you basically create a tailwind.config.js file in your project root, and then inside of that, I think it generates one for you when you run a init, and it will fill it with all of the kind of default styles. But then if you so choose to, you could name your colors anything and use them inside of Tailwind. You can do it with the border radius, with padding. You can do it with shadows. You can add your own Tailwind plugins to manage a gradient. So you can say gradient red, green, and the plugin will make it will make the color gradient red, green on the background. But yeah, basically that's kind of my journey with Tailwind. And so let's say you don't use all of the utilities, which is going to be a concern. Because obviously, if you've got this big kind of like Tailwind thing with like 1,000 utilities, utility classes, they're all going to be put in your CSS. But obviously, Tailwind's a post CSS plugin, and you can chain post CSS plugins. So you could use something like purge CSS, which lets you specify the HTML and template files, and it basically strips out any unused CSS rules, which can like massively reduce the size of your generated CSS. So it works pretty well with Tailwind because we also have the utility classes that it has the apply, and so it knows that those utilities are being used as well. But I think that's it. Thank you.